In 1869, a child named Eleanor Price began whispering names carved on gravestones she had never seen. She spoke of battles she never fought and homes she had never entered, memories that did not belong to her. Was she cursed, blessed, or something far darker? Stay with us as we uncover her chilling story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story, and share your thoughts below. The year was 1869. America was still reeling from the Civil War, only 4 years past. The battlefields had grown quiet, yet grief still clung to families in every town, village, and farmhouse. Fathers never returned, sons lay buried beneath distant soil, and mothers whispered prayers for loved ones lost. Even in Vermont, far from the bloodiest fronts, the war's shadow lingered. Empty chairs at supper tables spoke louder than words. In the rolling hills of rural Vermont, communities were small, tightly woven, and cautious of outsiders. Most families lived on modest farms or work trades that kept the community alive: carpenters, mill workers, and blacksmiths. Life was harsh, especially during the long winters, where bitter winds pressed against wooden walls and silence stretched for days. People depended on one another not just for survival, but for their sense of belonging. In such places, gossip moved faster than rivers, and secrets could never remain hidden for long. Religion ruled daily life. Nearly every family attended church, and the sermons shaped their understanding of good and evil, salvation and damnation. But alongside Christianity lurked an undercurrent of belief in older, darker things. Neighbors whispered of curses, strange signs, and bad omens. Many carried quiet superstitions, passed down from grandparents' folk wisdom they dared not speak of openly. And yet, in the years after the Civil War, a new fascination had spread across America: spiritualism. Families broken by loss gathered in candlelit rooms, joining seances, hoping for messages from the dead. Mediums promised to speak with husbands fallen at Antietam, or children claimed by fever. Some dismissed these gatherings as trickery. Others swore they had heard the voices of the departed. It was in this climate, half anchored in stern faith, half pulled by hope for contact with the beyond, that Eleanor Price's story unfolded. Eleanor's town was not much more than a cluster of wooden houses. A one-room schoolhouse, a modest church, and a few shops clustered near a crossroads. By day, the town appeared ordinary: farmers tilling soil, children playing by streams, women hanging laundry in the wind. But by night, shadows pressed in. Oil lamps flickered. The silence of the surrounding woods seemed to listen. And when rumors began to circulate about a young girl who spoke of things she could not possibly know, people were quick to listen and quicker to fear. The environment in which Eleanor grew up carried contradictions. On one hand, it was a place of innocence. Children walked barefoot along dusty lanes. Women baked bread in stone ovens. Men traded stories on porches. But beneath this simplicity lurked fragility. Illness could strike at any time. A poor harvest could mean hunger. A single scandal could unravel a family's reputation forever. In such a world, anything unexplained was rarely met with curiosity. It was met with suspicion. The Price family, modest but hardworking, were no different. They attended church faithfully. They minded their duties. They lived without excess. And yet, when their youngest daughter began whispering names of the dead, her strange words threatened to shatter the fragile balance between faith, superstition, and survival. To understand why the town reacted so sharply, one must grasp how people in 1869 saw the world. For them, the boundary between life and death was thin. Children often died young, taken by fevers, accidents, or harsh winters. Families were used to loss, but never numb to it. And so the thought of a child recalling lives not her own lives cut short was both terrifying and oddly believable. Newspapers, of the time occasionally printed. Sensational stories of children with second sight, or adults claiming to channel spirits. Some accounts were ridiculed. Others drew crowds. These tales created a backdrop of possibility where Eleanor's claims could not easily be dismissed. She was not the first to say she had seen beyond the veil, but in a small Vermont town where everyone knew her family, her case felt personal, undeniable, and deeply unsettling. The stage was set, a grieving nation, a community bound by strict moral codes, and a rising obsession with the afterlife. Into this world stepped Eleanor Price, a child whose voice would soon carry stories of lives she never lived, deaths she never suffered, and tragedies buried in the soil beneath her feet. The people of her town could not yet know it, but they were standing at the threshold of a mystery that would challenge their faith, their reason, and their fear. And once Eleanor began to speak, there would be no turning back. Eleanor Price was born in the spring of 1860, just before the storm of the Civil War broke across the nation. By 1869, she was 9 years old, a quiet and watchful child who carried herself with a seriousness far beyond her years. Neighbors often remarked that she seemed older than her age, as if she were a girl with the weight of unspoken knowledge pressing upon her. Physically, Eleanor was delicate. She had a pale complexion that gave her an almost ghostly appearance in the harsh Vermont winters. Her hair, a light brown, fell straight to her shoulders, often pulled back with a simple ribbon. Her eyes, gray, sharp, and unblinking, were what people remembered most. When Eleanor looked at you, it was as though she were searching past your face into something deeper, hidden within. Her family was modest but respectable. Her father, Jonathan Price, worked as a carpenter. He was known in town for his skill with wood, often building tables, chairs, and the occasional coffin when death came to a household. He was a quiet man, one who believed in order, discipline, and the importance of keeping one's reputation clean in a town where whispers could ruin a family. Her mother, Margaret Price, was a deeply religious woman. She attended every church service, often staying behind to help clean or arrange the hymnal books. After losing an infant son to fever 3 years before Eleanor's birth, Margaret clung fiercely to faith as both comfort and shield. She believed in God's will, but she also feared the devil's reach. Eleanor, her only surviving child, was at once her greatest blessing and her greatest worry. From the start, Eleanor was different. Unlike other children who ran barefoot through fields or shouted laughter along the creeks, Eleanor was drawn to solitude. She preferred sitting with a book, sketching in the dirt, or listening to the wind through the trees. Teachers described her as intelligent but distant, a child who answered questions with precision, but rarely joined in games or chatter. It was when she began to speak of things she could not possibly know that her parents grew uneasy. One evening, at the supper table, Eleanor set down her spoon and said softly, "The mud was thick at Antietam." The water ran red. Jonathan froze. Margaret, trembling, demanded to know where Eleanor had heard such words. The child only stared back with her gray eyes and whispered, "I was there." At first, her parents assumed she had overheard men in town speaking of the war. But as days passed, Eleanor revealed details no child should know. She described uniforms in exact colors, the thunder of cannons, the smell of blood and gunpowder hanging in the air. She spoke of lying in the mud, crying out for her mother as her life slipped away. Her words were not the retelling of a story. She spoke as if she had lived it. The Prices tried to dismiss it. They told her not to repeat such things. But Eleanor's memories only grew stronger. In the middle of the night, she would wake screaming names that her parents later discovered belonged to soldiers buried in distant counties. Margaret began to fear that her daughter was possessed, that the devil had taken root in her child's soul. She begged Jonathan to seek the pastor's guidance, but Jonathan resisted. To him, This was nonsense. Children imagined things. And yet, he could not deny the shiver that passed through him when Eleanor described places she had never been, in words too precise for imagination. The whispers began to spread beyond their home. Eleanor's teacher told Margaret that the girl had written in perfect detail a map of a battlefield during a lesson. When asked how she knew, Eleanor simply replied, "Because I was there." Other children began to avoid her. Once, during a game near the schoolhouse, Eleanor looked at a classmate and quietly murmured the name of the girl's dead uncle, someone Eleanor had never met, never even heard of. The girl burst into tears, and the children scattered. Calling Eleanor cursed Dot by summer, the Prices could no longer hide their unease. At church, Eleanor sat still, eyes fixed on the pastor, but sometimes her lips moved silently. A neighbor swore she was repeating the sermon word for word before the pastor spoke it. Aloud, her father tried to tighten discipline. He ordered Eleanor to keep quiet, to behave like a proper child. But punishment did nothing. The more they tried to silence her, the more the strange knowledge spilled forth. Eleanor began to describe things not only from the war, but from tragedies closer to home. She recounted the collapse of a barn that had killed a farmer years earlier. She described the color of the man's shirt, the sound of the beams snapping, details known only to those who had witnessed the accident. Jonathan grew fearful. He locked away his tools at night, as if the strange force within his daughter might drive her to some unholy act. Margaret prayed endlessly, clutching Eleanor at night, as if holding her tightly would protect her soul. Yet, despite their fear, there were moments when the Prices looked upon their daughter with awe. How could she, a child, know these things unless some hidden truth was moving through her? Was she chosen by God, or cursed by darker powers? The town, already ripe with superstition, began to murmur. Some said Eleanor was a vessel of divine messages. Others claimed she was marked for evil. For the Prices, there was no safe path forward. To defend her was to invite suspicion. To condemn her was to deny their own blood. By the end of that summer, Eleanor Price was no longer just a quiet child in a small Vermont town. She was becoming a figure of dread and fascination, the girl whose words carried the weight of lives she had never lived. And though her parents tried to shield her, the whispers of neighbors were growing louder. The stage was set for Eleanor's strange abilities to be revealed more publicly, events that would draw the entire town into a spiral of fear, faith, and judgment. By the autumn of 1869, Eleanor Price's unsettling memories had shifted from strange curiosities within her home to events that forced the entire community to take notice. It began with a walk into the woods. One crisp morning, Eleanor asked her father if she could accompany him while he went to fetch timber. Jonathan hesitated. He had grown increasingly uneasy about leaving her alone with others, fearing what she might say, but at last he agreed. As they walked among the birch and maple trees, Eleanor suddenly tugged at his sleeve and whispered, "I know this place." "I lived here once." Jonathan frowned. The spot they stood upon was nothing more than overgrown brush, scattered with mossy stones. But Eleanor pressed forward, moving with strange certainty. She brushed aside vines and revealed the collapsed foundation of a long-abandoned homestead. The outlines of a hearthstone, nearly buried, peeked from beneath the soil. Eleanor crouched beside it and placed her small hand upon the cold rock. "This was our fire," she murmured. Jonathan felt his chest tighten. The property had been forgotten for decades. Few in town even remembered who had lived there. Yet Eleanor spoke with the quiet confidence of someone recalling her own childhood home. When pressed, she described the family who had lived there, a man with a beard, the mother who sang, the baby who died in the winter. Jonathan said nothing, but that night he told Margaret. She crossed herself 3 times and wept. Word of the discovery spread quickly, for Jonathan could not keep the matter entirely quiet. Soon townsfolk began to whisper that Eleanor was more than peculiar, that she was touched by forces unseen. Other signs followed. At school, Eleanor began muttering during lessons. Her teacher, Mrs. Hawley, thought at first that she was speaking nonsense. But then, one morning, Eleanor recited a prayer in German, a language the teacher recognized from her own immigrant parents. When asked how she knew the words, Eleanor simply replied, "It is how my mother used to pray." The problem, of course, was that Eleanor's real mother spoke no German, nor had Eleanor ever been taught the language. At church, matters grew worse. During Sunday sermons, Eleanor would stare intently at Pastor Whitlock. Sometimes her lips moved silently as he spoke, matching his words in eerie unison, as though she already knew the sermon before he gave it. Parishioners began to avoid sitting near her pew. A few mothers clutched their children tightly, fearful of her gaze. Pastor Whitlock, a stern man with piercing eyes, became increasingly troubled. He had heard of cases where children claimed to see spirits, but he believed such things to be the devil's trickery. One evening, he visited the Price household unannounced. Sitting stiffly at their wooden table, he warned Jonathan and Margaret that Eleanor's knowledge was not of God. "Satan wears many masks," he said, "and sometimes he chooses the innocent to do his work." Margaret trembled, clutching Eleanor to her side. Jonathan, torn between skepticism and fear, could not dismiss the weight of the pastor's words. Eleanor herself seemed caught between worlds. At times she played quietly, humming songs no one recognized. Other times she would stare into the distance, her face pale, lips moving as though speaking to someone unseen. When asked, she would say things like, "She is here," or "He remembers the fire." These pronouns had no clear referent, and her parents grew desperate for answers she could not give. One chilling evening, as the sun set in a crimson sky, Eleanor startled her mother by stopping suddenly in their yard. She pointed to the old stone well, long covered and unused, and whispered, "This is where she drowned." Margaret froze. To her knowledge, no one had drowned in that well. But a week later, Jonathan mentioned the tale to an elder in town, who paled at the memory. Yes, a woman had drowned there nearly 40 years earlier. Her name had been lost to time, but the story was true. How could Eleanor have known? The neighbors' whispers grew louder. Some declared Eleanor a prophet. Others muttered that she was cursed. Children crossed the street to avoid her. At the market, Margaret noticed women turning their backs, whispering behind their hands. The Price's once ordinary life had become a spectacle of suspicion. That the turning point came during a town gathering. As families prepared for a harvest meal, Eleanor suddenly spoke in front of everyone. She pointed at an old man, Mr. Cummings, and said softly, "Your brother is waiting for you. He died with rope around his neck." The color drained from the man's face. Years earlier, his brother had hanged himself in despair, a truth kept hidden even from many in the town. The revelation shattered the gathering into uneasy silence. Some gasped. Others fled. Pastor Whitlock thundered that Eleanor must be cleansed of her unholy knowledge. From that moment on, Eleanor Price was no longer merely a peculiar child. She was a figure of fear. Mothers forbade their children from speaking to her. Men warned Jonathan that his carpentry orders might dry up if he did not deal with the girl. Margaret prayed until her voice broke. And Eleanor, caught in the storm of suspicion, seemed both terrified and strangely calm, as though she understood the destiny unraveling before her. The shadows around Eleanor were no longer confined to whispered dreams or quiet words at the supper table. They had stepped into the open, challenging her family, her town, and the pastor who now saw her not as a child, but as a vessel for something that must be destroyed. The first signs of darkness had arrived, and soon it would consume them all. As winter crept into Vermont in late 1869, Eleanor Price's strange gift or curse only deepened. What had begun as whispers in the family's parlor had spilled into the streets, and now the town carried her name on its lips with dread. The more people tried to silence her, the more impossible it became to ignore what she revealed. It began with fire. One December evening, Eleanor sat by the hearth, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Without warning, she began to cry. Between sobs, she whispered, "The flames took them all. The house burned while they slept." The mother tried to run, but she could not carry them all. Jonathan and Margaret, startled, begged her to explain. Eleanor pointed toward the north ridge and said only, "The ashes are there." The next day, Jonathan mentioned the words to an elder carpenter. The man turned pale and nodded. He remembered, 30 years earlier, a farmhouse on that ridge had burned to the ground, killing a mother and 2 children inside. The father, drunk and helpless, had survived. Few spoke of it anymore. Yet Eleanor, who had never been told, described it as if she had stood within the flames herself. Not long after, another vision came. Eleanor wandered past the old covered well, where weeks earlier she had whispered of drowning. This time, she clutched her throat, gasping and choking until her mother rushed to her side. When Margaret asked what had happened, Eleanor replied, "The cold water closed above me. I tried to scream, but no one heard." Her face was pale, her lips trembling. It was as though she had relived the death of the woman long gone. Each revelation deepened the town's unease. By now, Margaret could not step into the market without feeling eyes upon her. Some neighbors believed Eleanor was touched by God, capable of bringing hidden sins into the light. Others muttered that she was a witch, a vessel for spirits that had no place in the living world. The whispers of the community turned to quiet tests. A grieving mother, Mrs. Bradley, visited the Price home one night, candle in hand. She asked Eleanor if her infant son, taken by fever, was safe. Eleanor sat silently for a moment before murmuring, "He is warm now. He sleeps beside his grandmother. He does not cry anymore." Mrs. Bradley wept with relief. She spread word that the child was indeed a blessing. But others were horrified that parents would invite a child to speak with the dead. The most chilling moment came during a winter gathering at the church. Pastor Whitlock had gathered the congregation to remind them of God's power over darkness. As his sermon thundered, Eleanor stood abruptly from her pew. She fixed her eyes upon the pastor, and in a voice far too steady for a 9-year-old, declared, "You carry a secret buried beneath the earth. You cannot wash it away." The room fell silent. The pastor froze, his face pale, his hand trembling upon the pulpit. Eleanor's parents dragged her out before more could be said, but the damage was done. Murmurs filled the church that night. What did the child know? And what could the pastor, so stern in his warnings, be hiding? From that night on, Eleanor was no longer just feared. She was dangerous. Her parents begged her to remain silent, but her words spilled out like a flood. She began naming names: men who had stolen, women who had lied, families who had buried secrets thought long forgotten. In a town where reputation was everything, Eleanor's revelations carried the force of a hammer blow. Jonathan grew restless. He feared not only for Eleanor's safety, but for his own livelihood. Orders for carpentry dwindled. Old friends stopped visiting. Margaret clung to prayer, pleading that God would take the burden from her daughter. But Eleanor seemed powerless to stop herself. It was as if the memories pressed against her lips until they burst forth. One evening, Eleanor sat alone by the fire when she began to hum a tune. Margaret recognized it faintly. It was a lullaby, but not one she had ever sung. When she asked Eleanor where she had heard it, the child replied, "It is what my mother used to sing when I was her son." Margaret dropped her sewing in shock. A son? Eleanor was a girl. Yet she spoke with calm certainty, as though she recalled living another life entirely. The incidents reached a point where the town could no longer turn away. Some sought her out in secret, desperate to hear from lost loved ones. Others urged the pastor to take action before darkness consumed them all. And so Pastor Whitlock declared from the pulpit that Eleanor was no innocent child, but a vessel of unholy knowledge. "The devil," he thundered, "finds fertile ground in the young. We must cleanse her before his roots choke us all." The declaration divided the community. A few defended Eleanor, whispering that perhaps she was a prophet sent to reveal God's truth. But most were swayed by fear. The idea of a child speaking secrets she could not know was too much to bear. If Eleanor could uncover the sins of the town, what might she reveal next? The Prices found themselves trapped. To protect Eleanor meant to stand against the pastor and the town's rising fury. To silence her meant denying the child's strange, unstoppable gift. They could not win, and Eleanor, pale and solemn, seemed to understand. "They are afraid," she whispered one night to her mother. "But the dead are louder than the living. I cannot stop them." Her words chilled Margaret to her bones. For if the voices of the dead would not cease, then neither would the fear of the living. And soon that fear would reach its breaking point. By the early months of 1870, Eleanor Price's presence in the small Vermont town had become unbearable to many. Her strange revelations, fires long past, names of the dead, sins hidden in whispers, had unsettled neighbors, divided families, and cast suspicion even on the pastor himself. Fear was no longer a whisper in the back pews of the church. It was now a roar demanding action. Pastor Whitlock fanned the flames. Each Sunday his sermons grew harsher, his warnings sharper. He declared that Eleanor was not a prophet of God, but a vessel for evil, her young frame carrying the weight of demonic trickery. "The serpent," he thundered from the pulpit, "chooses the lamb. What seems innocent may hide the vilest corruption." Mothers pulled their children close, eyes darting toward Eleanor's pew. Fathers nodded grimly, some convinced that only a public cleansing could rid the town of her influence. The Prices, isolated and desperate, clung to one another. Jonathan's carpentry business had nearly collapsed. No one wished to hire a man whose daughter spoke curses over the dead. Margaret, once welcomed among the women of the congregation, now found herself shunned at the market. They prayed for relief, but none came. And Eleanor, pale and quiet, seemed to drift further away from childhood. She no longer laughed, no longer played, only listened to voices no one else could hear. The breaking point came on a frigid January evening. Snow lay heavy on the ground, muffling sound, when a group of townsfolk gathered in the church hall. Pastor Whitlock had called the meeting, declaring it was time to decide the girl's fate. Candlelight flickered against rough wooden walls as voices rose in heated debate. "She is cursed," one man spat. "Every word she speaks brings shame and fear. Are we to wait until she damns us all?" Another, an older woman whose husband had once asked Eleanor about their lost child, countered softly, "Perhaps she is touched by God. Who are we to silence what we do not understand?" The pastor slammed his hand upon the table. "Blasphemy! God does not send his word through children in shadows. He sends it through Scripture, through his chosen ministers. If you defend this girl, you defend the devil himself." The room fell into uneasy silence. And in that silence, Eleanor herself appeared. She had followed her parents, though they had begged her to stay home. Standing in the doorway, her small frame silhouetted by the snow outside, she spoke in a steady, chilling voice. "You fear me, because I know what you hide." Gasps filled the hall. Her gray eyes swept the room, lingering on faces pale with dread. "The tree still holds the rope," she whispered. "I can hear it creak in the wind." A murmur rippled through the crowd. She was speaking of the hanging, a tragedy many remembered, but few dared name. Decades earlier, a man had been found dead, swinging from a great oak at the edge of town. Some said it was suicide. Others whispered of vigilante justice. The rope, they said, had long since rotted away. Yet when men later visited the oak, they found deep grooves still etched into the bark marks of rope that had once borne a man's weight. The revelation was too much. Some townsfolk fled the hall in terror. Others shouted for the pastor to act. She must be cleansed. One voice cried, "She brings only death with her tongue." The pastor seized upon the moment. Pointing a trembling finger at Eleanor, he declared, "The devil walks in this child. We must purify her before he claims us all." Jonathan pulled Eleanor close, shielding her from the crowd. Margaret wept openly, begging them to leave her child alone. But the tide had turned. Fear had hardened into fury. Men muttered of old trials, of fire and water, of testing a witch's innocence through pain. The following days were thick with tension. Neighbors avoided the Prices' home, yet at night stones clattered against their shutters. Margaret swore she heard footsteps circling the house in the dark. Jonathan kept his tools by his bedside, prepared to defend his family. Eleanor herself seemed strangely resigned. One evening, as Margaret combed her hair by lamplight, the child whispered, "They will not forgive me. But the voices will not stop. They belong here as much as I do." Margaret broke down, clutching her daughter tightly, desperate to protect her from a world that no longer saw her as a child, but as a vessel of horror. The pastor pressed harder. He spoke of gathering the town for a ritual of cleansing, whether by prayer, fasting, or something harsher, he would not say. Rumors spread quickly that Eleanor would be dragged to the church, that she might face the old well, or even the river. The echoes of Salem haunted their imaginations. Though no one spoke the name aloud. Jonathan considered fleeing with his family, but poverty bound him. He had no land to sell, no savings to carry them far. They were trapped, hemmed in by snow, debt, and the tightening grip of a fearful town. The tension reached its peak one bitter morning when Eleanor collapsed in the schoolyard. Her classmates screamed as she fell to her knees, gasping for air. Her eyes rolled back, and in a voice not her own, she cried out, "I see the rope. I feel the fire." The earth will not forget. Teachers rushed to her side, but she lay trembling, her small body convulsing as though seized by unseen hands. When word of the collapse reached Pastor Whitlock, he declared it the final sign. "The devil takes her flesh," he proclaimed. "If we do nothing, he will claim our souls next." The stage was set. The town could no longer stand in uneasy silence. Fear had become action, and action would demand a price. The fever came swiftly. Within days of her collapse in the schoolyard, Eleanor Price was bedridden, her frail body burning with heat, while snowstorms raged outside. Margaret sat at her bedside day and night, pressing cool cloths to her forehead, whispering prayers through trembling lips. Jonathan kept to the shadows, pacing the floor, his face a mask of helplessness. News spread quickly that Eleanor had fallen ill. To some, it was proof that God's hand had intervened, punishing the child for her unholy speech. To others, it was a sign that the devil was being driven from her body. Either way, the town no longer saw her as just a sick little girl. They saw her as the battleground of forces far beyond human reach. Pastor Whitlock declared from the pulpit that the girl's fever was the judgment of heaven. "The fire of the Almighty burns away corruption," he thundered. "We must pray for her soul, but we must not forget the danger she carried among us." His words sealed Eleanor's fate in the minds of many. Even if she recovered, she would never again be seen as innocent. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor drifted in and out of delirium. Sometimes she lay still, whispering to unseen companions. Other times she cried out in voices that chilled those who listened. One night she clutched her mother's hand and gasped, "I've been here before. I've been here many times." Another night she begged for water, her voice echoing the drowning she had once described. Jonathan tried to shield Margaret from the growing hostility outside their home. Stones clattered against their shutters. A crude cross was nailed to their fence, a warning from neighbors who believed the girl carried evil within her. Food, once freely shared in winter, stopped arriving. The Prices were alone, trapped in their home with their sick child and the weight of the town's condemnation. Eleanor grew weaker. Her cheeks hollowed, her eyes sank deep into her skull. Yet even in her frailty, her words cut to the bone. "The dead are calling," she whispered one evening as Margaret wiped sweat from her brow. "They have waited so long. I must go to them," Margaret sobbed, pressing her child against her chest. But Eleanor's gaze was far away, fixed on something unseen. On a bitter February morning, as frost clung to the window panes, Eleanor stirred for the last time. Her breathing was shallow, her voice faint, but her words carried a chilling certainty. "I've lived before. I'll live again." Then, with a final sigh, her small body went still. Margaret screamed, her cries carrying into the snow-laden streets. Jonathan stood frozen, unable to move, his hands trembling as he stared at his lifeless child. The town's reaction was swift and divided. Some gathered quietly at the church, thanking God that the danger had passed. "The curse is broken," they murmured. "The devil has been defeated." Others were uneasy, whispering that perhaps the girl had been something more, that her words were not lies, but truths the living were not meant to hear. Pastor Whitlock insisted on a simple burial, refusing any elaborate rites. He spoke briefly over her grave, declaring her soul to be in God's hands, but warning the congregation to guard against such darkness in the future. Few lingered after the service. Snow covered the small wooden marker within days, as if the town wished to bury not only the child, but the memory of her as well. Yet, memory has a way of lingering. In the years that followed, strange stories surfaced in neighboring counties. A boy in Rutland began speaking of battles he had never fought, recalling in vivid detail the smoke of Shiloh and the cries of dying men. A girl in Montpelier described drowning in a well, her words echoing Eleanor's last visions. Though no one openly linked these tales to the child from the small Vermont town, those who remembered Eleanor Price could not ignore the similarity. It was as if her words had not died with her, but had taken root elsewhere, waiting to be spoken again. Jonathan and Margaret never recovered from the loss. Jonathan buried himself in his work, hammering wood with a desperation that bordered on madness. Margaret withdrew into silence, her eyes hollow, her prayers unending. Their once modest but steady lives crumbled into sorrow. As for the town, they carried on as if Eleanor had never lived. The schoolhouse filled with new children. The market bustled once more. The church bells rang each Sunday. But beneath the surface, unease lingered. When the wind howled through the trees or the snow fell heavy against the roofs, some swore they heard a child's voice whispering secrets meant for no living soul. Eleanor Price was gone, but the questions she left behind haunted every heart that had heard her speak. Was she cursed? Was she gifted? Or was she proof that death is not the end, but merely a door through which the same soul may pass again and again? The story of Eleanor Price did not end with her burial in the frozen ground of a Vermont hillside. Her body lay beneath the snow, but her words, those haunting whispers of lives, not her own, lingered in the minds of everyone who had heard them. Some tried to forget, others could not. And for a few, her memory became an open wound, a question that refused to heal. What do we make of a child who remembers lives she never lived? For the people of her town, the answer was divided. To many, Eleanor was a curse, a vessel of dark spirits that had stirred fear and suspicion. They buried her and turned their backs, hoping silence would erase her. Yet for others, those who had lost loved ones, those who heard her speak their names with trembling certainty, Eleanor was something else entirely. A glimpse into a mystery larger than faith, larger than death itself. Her case, though forgotten by history books, fits into a wider tapestry of stories from the 19th century. The post-Civil War years were thick with grief. Families across America were desperate for signs that the dead were not truly gone. Mediums filled parlors, seances promised contact, and whispers of reincarnation, though rarely spoken in church, drifted through the cracks of belief. Eleanor Price was not the only child to speak of strange memories, but in her small Vermont town, she became the focus of all that fear and longing. The legacy of Eleanor is not just the story of one child. It is the story of how communities respond when the unexplained enters their midst. Some turned to faith, insisting she was touched by the devil. Others leaned toward hope, daring to believe she might have carried messages from the beyond. But all of them, in one way or another, were changed by her. Even today, her tale raises questions that have no easy answers. Was Eleanor suffering from illness hallucinations, brought on by fever or some hidden condition? Was she unusually gifted, able to observe and repeat details others overlooked? Or was she truly remembering something no living child should remember? If souls can pass from body to body, carrying fragments of memory across generations, then Eleanor's words may not have been madness, but evidence of something far more mysterious. What unsettles us most is not that a child spoke of death, but that she did so with such precision, such conviction. She was not guessing. She was remembering. And so we are left with a haunting thought. If Eleanor Price lived before, then perhaps she lives again. Perhaps, somewhere, a child now whispers in dreams of lives never lived, carrying forward the same burden that once crushed a little girl in 1869. Her story reminds us of the fragility of innocence, the weight of fear, and the terrible power of belief. Communities can heal or destroy, protect or persecute, depending on how they choose to confront the unknown. Eleanor's neighbors chose fear, and in doing so, they may have silenced something extraordinary. But what about us? As you listen to her story more than 150 years later, you too must choose how to interpret it. Was she cursed? Was she gifted? Or was she proof that memory stretches beyond one lifetime, echoing through time like a voice carried on the wind? We may never know the truth of Eleanor Price, but perhaps that is the very point. Some stories are not meant to give us answers. They are meant to remind us that life holds mysteries beyond our grasp. And sometimes, those mysteries speak through the smallest voices. So, what do you believe? Could a 9-year-old child truly carry the memories of lives long past? Or was Eleanor Price simply a frightened little girl, crushed beneath the weight of her community's fear? Tell us your thoughts in the comments. Share this story with others who, like you, are drawn to the strange corners of history. And if you want to hear more tales of forgotten tragedies, of mysteries buried by time, then subscribe to our channel. Your support keeps these voices alive, so that Eleanor's story and others like it will never be silenced again.